Everyone, just give people a moment to sort of settle in. I see we've still got a couple of connecting to audio, and I know if you've been sitting in the waiting room, there's always that surprise of, oh God, it moved. So I'll let everybody sort of settle in, and then we might get underway. And let's see whether, sorry about the little delay that we had. We had, as usual, a few Zoom technical issues happening in the background, but hopefully we've sorted everything out now. And oh God, now I'm suddenly enormous on the screen, and so I'm going to share the screen so I'm no longer enormous again. Okay. We want. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see the proper full screen. Excellent. I have to make sure that I can actually see what I'm looking at, and away we go. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone, for this afternoon's virtual cafe with Nev Jones. It is my great pleasure to be in conversation with Nev Jones. I'd like to start off, as we always do, with acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. For me, it is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, but I know that there are people from lots of different lands and countries with us today, and we pay our respects to elders past and present, and extend that to any Indigenous people who may have joined us today. And we also always just say, you know, the Healing from the Ground from Dennis Golding is our reminder of what we do within Alive, both from working from Indigenous perspectives, but working more broadly about the importance of connections and healing in many different ways. The other thing that we often do, or we always do at the beginning of these sort of things, is say that we are a very diverse translational mental health research centre. And this means that there are lots of different framings and lots of different language that people actually use in these spaces. And often what we might hear in some of these is language or framings that's not what we might prefer, and this might be a bit uncomfortable for people. I invite everybody to have a bit of a reflection on that, but if it is too much for you, take a break, grab a cuppa, come back, join us when you can. But always do have a think about sitting with a bit of discomfort if there's things that are not your preferred framings. And of course, we always recognise the lived experience that's in the room with us today. And I never feel like when we're talking lived experience that we have to remind people to speak honourably and respectfully, because that's how we actually approach things. But that is that invitation and that reminder there that we are coming from multiple perspectives. And again, we need to look after ourselves and each other. So just a little intro to the Centre and to the Lived Experience Research Collective before we get in to having a conversation with Nev. And this is also to give Nev a few ideas too as we get into a conversation, because today is going to be a little bit different to usual. We're not going to actually have a formal presentation. It's going to be a bit of a discussion about some of the similarities and differences in lived experience involvement between our different countries, and particularly what Nev's been learning in her multi-journeys through Australian different contexts in the last couple of weeks. So this is our centre on a page, basically, where we outline what our mission and our values and our vision actually are. And you'll notice that lived expertise is our top value there, and that we do have a research program that is essentially all about lived experience research. And we do operate the entire centre on our embedded model of lived experience. And so we are driving very much from a lived experience perspective. And what I'll draw your attention to down in this corner here is that our Lived Experience Research Collective, which is our tailored capacity building arm, has now reached 251 members. And that's 251 people throughout Australia and a few people from around the world who have both a lived experience and an interest or experience in doing mental health research, who have joined us to collectively do lived experience research. And if you told me a few years ago that the collective would be up over 250 members, I would have probably laughed. And I was excited when we reached 100. So it's a real delight to me to see so many people with lived experience engaging with the work that we do. And that really helps throughout the other networks that we have to ensure that there is a really strong representation of people with lived experience, and particularly in collaboration with the Co-Design Living Labs model, which is our community-based model for involving people in co-design exercises. This is all part of what a really vibrant and exciting initiative Alive actually is. So as I said, today is hosted by the Lived Experience Research Collective, for which I am the program lead. This is about capacity building specifically for lived experience research. And so whilst many of our members within the Lived Experience Research Collective are also members of our more general Next Generation Research Network, there are a proportion there, 30%, who are not university-based. And everybody who's in the collective is actually interested in strengthening and growing expertise that is specific to lived experience. And so particularly next year, what we're hoping to do is actually move into more of those really tailored activities for people with lived experience beyond what the usual offerings are for early career researchers in university contexts. The map there just shows you our distribution around the country. Because Alive itself is actually based in Melbourne, you can see we've got quite a heavy Victorian basis there, but it is good that we do actually have researchers from right around the entire country and a few international people. And I have invited Nev to join us if she wishes to. This is our co-leads. These are all the people who have a bit more experience and have stepped up to help us in the journey of doing things. They lead a lot of our activities, and they're, when we have our gatherings and other things that I'll show you in a moment, as some of our activities, they're the ones who actually help us out in that process. They're great people. They are tireless in their engagement with all of the activities that we actually do. And so it's great to have that really vibrant set of people who are stepping up and helping us with it. So our activities. So our main activity for the collective is our gatherings. The primary purpose of this is a meet and greet. And this is really just that opportunity that we don't get very often to get together as people with lived experience, and particularly as people who are doing research in lived experience, and have a talk with each other about what are we doing, what are the issues we're facing, how are we overcoming them. But it's also a learning exchange. So sometimes we might give a brief presentation about something and then exchange knowledge with our collective around what else they'd like to see or what are the skills that they'd like to develop. We also have co-design sessions within the gatherings. So a real key one that we had was, what does effective involvement look like? Because our impact evaluation team were really interested in evaluating the lived experience engagement across our centre, and particularly what kind of impact it was having. And my question back to them, well, what does effective look like, and from whose perspective? And so we've been working on that within the collective. We also do the I Learn short courses, which are, a lot of these are straddling both lived experience researchers and more traditional researchers who need to learn more about lived experience involvement. But that's where I said that next year we're looking to develop quite a few more of those that are building capacity and skills specifically for our lived experience people. And we're also in the process of developing a national strategy for lived experience and mental health research. And this will bring everything together, including that long conversation project, which is our specific flagship project looking at the who, what, where and how of lived experience research in Australia, to actually co-design a typology and underpin the strategic directions for lived experience in mental health research in Australia. And this is quite exciting for us. And Nev and I might venture back later to a discussion we were having last week about whether we want to go international with such an endeavour. But it is, we've really recognised the importance of the structures that are needed specifically for research in Australia, because there are some good guidelines and frameworks for lived experience that are more focused on service production now and service provision, but there are some peculiarities about the academic context and about research that we think is quite important to address head on. So before we get into the convo, just a quick bit of advertising. We do have a carer, family and kinship priority study open at the moment. This is part of our annual priority setting, lived experience priority setting for the centre. This year we've been focusing on groups that are underrepresented in our shared database. And so we have been making all of the priorities that people with lived experience have been sharing with us through our studies available in the database. And I'm sure one of the hub team can put a direct link to the database for you. And we've just been focusing on where we don't have enough views yet, where people might be a bit underrepresented. And so at the moment, it's the carer, family and kinship group. And that's for people who have only carer, family, kinship, or also have their own personal experience. So please do fill that in. And here's a quick rundown of what is coming up in the next few months with us. So our next quarterly forum is in early December, and that will be a real focus on our roadmap. So understanding where we've come from, where we're going, what are all the priorities telling us. And then next year, we've got our usual e-networking event and symposium in March. And our next virtual cafe on this one is by Laura Tarzio. So now we get to the main show. Nev. So I don't know about you, Nev, but I always feel very awkward when somebody reads one of these bios out, when you write them down and then you hear somebody read them and you go, oh, hang on. That's not quite what I expected. But I'll leave it on the screen there for a moment. I mean, I feel so privileged that Nev has come over and joined us to have this conversation because as, you know, a community engaged mental health services researcher from a slightly different background to my own, we've had some great conversations over the last few weeks about, you know, Nev's experiences in her tenure position as well as her experiences at PIT at the moment. And I think that there's quite a lot that we can all learn from having the opportunity to have a bit of a chat and to talk about what some of those similarities and differences are between Australia and the US. So that's enough sharing from me, because I'm going to open it to you, Nev, now and just say, you know, as a starting point, what are some of the things that you've noticed over, and, you know, what is it like doing lived experience research in the US, and what have you noticed with the differences for it here?
Thanks, Michelle. Well, and first, I just want to thank you and Vicky and the whole Alive team in Melbourne for just having been incredibly welcoming. I had a really amazing time last week, and I know there are a couple of people also here in the audience who were part of the co-writing workshop. But to me, these experiences were just really incredible, very unlike anything I've ever had the opportunity to participate in the US. So just thank you to you all for letting me join these amazing spaces. Turning back to the US then. So dedicated lived experience researcher roles are essentially non-existent in the US. I think just in the last couple of years, we have started to see a very, very small number of part-time research assistant or consulting kind of roles that are specifically advertised for people with lived experience. But I have never seen anything kind of close to a full-time role or any kind of permanent or more permanent stable role. So in that sense, it's a different landscape. There are a number of us doing this work, but usually we are occupying roles, especially in kind of research and in academic institutions that, you know, aren't specifically labeled as lived experience, but we're working from those perspectives. I think sometimes that there are both good and bad things about where the United States is at right now in terms of this work. I think there is less kind of extractive, predatory kind of behavior from researchers, centers, or institutions who, because there's a lot of pressure from funders to have a, you know, nominal lived experience component, they're just sort of kind of using people for that purpose. So because there's not a lot of pressure in the US to do that, There's not that same degree that I think especially maybe one sees in the UK around everybody needs to have their lived experience involvement component on a grant. But there's often not commensurate buy-in, so that can often take a very kind of tokenistic and superficial form, and that can be really harmful to people who are put in that position. We do, as the US responds to more kind of international development in this area and more kind of perceived pressure in the sense that, well, if other funders in other countries think it's important, maybe we should too. So I think we are seeing a shift in the US right now. And that's again, both good and bad for exactly these reasons, because I think it also opens up the potential that we see a lot more just kind of very extractive kind of integration or inclusion in a superficial way, right, of folks with lived experience in research projects. Yeah. So we're much, much less developed. It's much less institutionalized. There's not guidance in any form really from our primary funder, the National Institute of Mental Health, but we are starting to move in that direction. And I guess to summarize otherwise, meanwhile, there are certainly a bunch of us on the ground who are just doing this work however we can.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I mean, you and I had an interesting conversation last week about that both of us have looked to the UK more than to each other on this, but then both made the same observation that things seem to be going backwards in the UK. So, what are your thoughts on, do you think that we do we need to stage an intervention for the UK to stop them going backwards so that we can, or what is it that we might be able to learn from that as well as from each other to keep things going forward away from the text tokenistic stuff?
Yeah, yeah. And just to say, I mean, yeah, we did have a really rich conversation about this, and I think there would be kind of so much to be learned from sort of comparative country case studies where one could kind of dig deeper, right, into, why things have evolved maybe in different ways and, in some cases gotten better and then worse. I actually remember interviewing Diana Rose in the UK in London back in 2014. And I remember her saying that lived experience involvement had kind of reached its zenith in the UK at that point, and she felt it was going to backslide, which in retrospect actually seems like she sort of kind of foresaw what was going to happen. Some of that I do think is there's always a risk once things become very mainstream that they can kind of lose their critical edge. In a sense, this is sort of like kind of co-optation, institutional co-optation. And that when it's the double-edged side of a requirement that you have lived experience involvement. So the National Institute of Health Research in the UK, NIHR, requires it, but without maybe there really being buy-in broadly across researchers. And so then you end up with this very high volume of folks who need their kind of their lived experience liaisons, but they're not really deeply bought in. And so they're not actually doing the hard work because, real co-production is hard work, and it's trust building and relationship building in a deep and sustained way that doesn't gel very well with sort of mainstream research culture of productivity and efficiency and getting as much money as possible as quickly as possible. So it's really a different kind of paradigm to really build relationships and build trust and listen rather than, always lead as most primary investigators are used to. So I think maybe those requirements in a sense have actually kind of backfired in the UK, as well as I think the UK academic context is even more grant driven, certainly than the US and maybe Australia. So I think just the race for grants and money, again, is really in tension with like the deeper kind of community building work involved in our space and kind of lived experience research and process. Like, I think, in some deep way, most folks probably on the lived experience side, really believe in the importance of process and ethics and values. And it's not just about racing to a deliverable, racing to a new grant proposal, that sort of thing. And if that's the context in which the work is happening, I think it maybe kind of can't be done well, or there's an awful lot of tension and additional challenge in doing the work well. In the US, I think that we're outside of medical schools and psychiatry departments, there is still pressure around grants, but I think less, and it gives more room to really kind of think about what matters and process in a way that matters. But I think there's a lot more to learn, and like, we tend to kind of have these conversations, but really trying to kind of systematically look into it and think about different histories and why things have kind of played out differently would be really valuable.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, certainly my own experience of research in Australia has always been grant funded research, and so I'm really unwillingly very familiar with the pressures that come with that. And I'll pick up on something you said about those requirements actually encouraging tokenism, and I agree with that, and I think um, the special initiative under which Alive received funding was, I think, one of the more interesting lived experience driven processes in Australia to try to move away from the tick box and the not actually being really genuine, because one of the things that we don't see a lot of yet is lived experience involvement in grant assessment. Um,
Mm-hmm.
do you have anything of that sort of nature in the US? I know you sort of said there's not a lot involvement and there's not a lot, but through the NIMH or anything, are there any of those mechanisms?
Absolutely none, but I think there are folks at NIMH now, relatively newly hired, who are really working internally to try to make that happen. Even I, PI of multiple large NIMH grants, have never been able to review for NIMH. So
Wow.
yeah, so I think that there's some real kind of barriers, and historically a lot of conservatism maintaining the status quo that has gone even into the selection of reviewers. That's a huge potential mechanism of change, and definitely is not something that has been kind of formalized here, but I think that there are people who really kind of grasp that when you really diversify the reviewers, you start to diversify the work that's being funded.
Yeah, and I like to think that there are some indicators that the National Health and Medical Research Council, in particular, is trying to move in those directions. We do have the Statement on Consumer and Community Involvement in Research, which has been around for more than 20 years. But as is the risk with a lot of these things, it does tend to keep things, because it's a requirement, although a loose one. It does sort of encourage that surface level, oh, we're supposed to put this in here, there's a page that we're supposed to address, so we'll just do whatever we think. And certainly from a process point of view, there are consumer advisors on their grant panels, but they don't score. They comment only. And I look at some of these things, and it's those underlying little signals that, okay, we'll let you in the room, but don't that picture that I showed you the other day, that I use in some of my work, which is, keep your trained monkey around, but don't let them run the show. And I worry that some of the things that we are still working under in Australia are still encouraging that very surface level engagement for this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And Vicki and Michelle and I spent a lot of time like kind of talking about and processing this last week, but I think I am like increasingly concerned about how, kind of tokenization, meaning when institutions, research centers bring in lived experience involvement, but in a very superficial way. But it's often presented as if it was something much stronger, much more robust, that this really, really kind of undermines, I think, what all of us are working for, and how thinking and strategizing about how we can kind of respond to that. Because if funders, policymakers, government entities of various different kinds see, a center or an institute doing things in this very superficial way and say, well, that's enough. That's great. That's done it, right? That's checked the box for us. We're never going to get to the more transformative work, which happens through, an actual shift in agendas through different kind of folks being involved, not just in priority setting, but then actually making the decisions about this is not just a priority, but this is now what's going to happen. We're going to start asking these questions that haven't been asked. We're going to start documenting these experiences that maybe the movement, kind of grassroots movements, have been talking about, but have not been legitimized through research that says this is not just people out in the community talking. This is real. These things are really happening to people. These experiences are real and they're ongoing. So I think I worry a lot, as we have been talking about, right? But really, really, really worry and keep asking myself, what is the way forward here? Whether it is kind of calling out, entities that are kind of claiming to do co-production or involvement well, but are not, or whether it is sort of kind of a friendlier engagement approach of really trying to win over people's hearts and minds, like really trying to reach people at a heart level about, have you thought about what this really does? Have you really deeply considered what you're doing when you publicly claim to be doing co-production or, kind of meaningful involvement, and actually it's very, very superficial? Like, that is hurting the very community, right, that this research is supposed to be aimed at helping or kind of improving outcomes within. So I can't, I think I struggle a lot with, we know there's all these problems. How do we address this? How do we change? Is it changing people? Is it, is it that funders need to get much, much more strict, funders and journals, much, much more strict about what the standards and expectations are, requiring proof that you're actually really doing the thing that you claim that you're going to be doing in a given project. So I don't know, and I know, again, for folks listening in the audience, really rich conversations between Vicki, Michelle, and I, like, just, what does one do? How does one move forward? How does one move the field forward, given, what we all know is happening?
And I'm going to open it up in a minute for people to fire questions at you. But before we do that, picking up on something you said very early on, and which was that you don't have a strong structure and connection in the US, and you're all just finding your own way, which, as I said to you, is not that unusual here, in that we're only just moving into that kind of space. But what I'm really interested in is, what are your core values and principles that you are actually working towards in your little individual flag waving in the US?
Yeah. That's a great question and a really difficult question. I mean, I do think that I think a lot about this kind of principle, which in the US gets talked about the most in kind of disability justice organizations and contexts of centering the most impacted. And how I tend to understand that is people who are the most harmed, or if one wants to frame that like, I guess more positively, who are the least benefiting. So whether it's policies, interventions, at whatever level, kind of really thinking about folks who are in many cases already facing, often multiple forms of kind of intersecting oppression, discrimination, disadvantage, vulnerability, and, how are they being impacted by that? And that's like sort of the starting point for really kind of understanding things, those perspectives. So I think of that as kind of an operative principle. I think a lot about increasingly, I think about ethics. And I say increasingly because I think sometimes there is sort of a temptation to want to honor, and I shouldn't say a temptation because we should all always be honoring all experiences at an individual level. But when we think about policy, we often need, I think, more of a real vision. What does it mean to actually, what does social justice or disability justice or justice in the mental health space mean? And so many people are kind of trapped in such oppressive systems and practices that they may come to see things as natural, inevitable, necessary, maybe even beneficial. And we also have to have this vision of something else, a different kind of system, something that is really more fundamentally about justice and doesn't just sort of accept the social inequality. I think in, kind of all of our countries, doesn't accept the levels of poverty that folks with disabilities are more often than not all over the world experiencing. And just says this is not acceptable, right? The structural conditions people are living in are not acceptable, and what they are subjected to all too often is just not acceptable. And we need this vision of something very, very different and need to move towards. But again, I think kind of historically, I maybe have gotten much more trapped in, just kind of individual perspectives and trying to honor them, and maybe losing sight, even in my own work, of we actually need a really strong and bold vision of somewhere else where we're headed, and somewhere else that is most fundamentally driven by ideas of ethics and social justice, not effectiveness, not that paradigm, not the paradigm of effectiveness, which is always limited and reductionistic, but a paradigm of justice. So I'm still struggling with this, but kind of thinking aloud.
But I think we all are, and I think I think that's one of the beauties of being able to sit and have a think aloud on these things. And we've asked in that long conversation project, we've asked people to think about their principles and things so that we can try to draw them together. But we're just in the process at the moment of having a look at all the diverse things that people say. And even in that piece of work, how do we honor all of those different ways of thinking, and don't be reductionist, or what we're doing within the centre, looking at that lost in translation kind of thing, where you spend so much time listening to the powerful voices or trying to come up with a couple of words that you actually lose the essence of what people are saying in the first place. All right, we're going to open it up now for questions. Now, I'm happy if our hosts take us off spotlighting so that we can actually now see the whole gallery. That would be a good start. And then I'm happy if people want to put questions in the chat. I see we've already got one in the chat. Or use the hand up function if you actually want to ask a question. But Sharon's asked at the beginning, do we have a balance between research focused on social injustice and research that hears about what systems get right?
Okay. Well, so to just jump in there, I mean, I think part of me wants to say most research, in fact, is research about what systems get right, at least from a certain perspective. Um, now, not necessarily like lived experience led or infused work on what systems get right, but if you think about most intervention research, um, researchers often with vested interests develop interventions and then they tend to publish a lot on how, amazing and wonderful their intervention is. And, everybody loves it. And so in some sense, we are already doing a lot of that. In another sense, maybe in a deeper, more nuanced way, we're not. So I think about, for instance, the importance of relationships and how often I hear from people has nothing to do with whether it's CBT, DBT, this, that, or the other named acronym. What matters to me is a person who really has invested in the relationship and who I've come to trust. So in some other way, maybe we're not, because maybe we're losing sight often of the things that matter the most. In place of, technology and interventions and shiny new digital things and all of that. But, and then on the flip side, in terms of social justice, I really worry, and for various people who have been meeting with me over the course of the past couple of weeks, they know that I was in Trieste, Italy, just a couple of weeks before. And I think this was just a really life-changing experience for me. I'm actually a very skeptical, cynical person. I had rather low expectations going there, and it just completely, rocked my world, so to speak. And I think about what has actually been like achieved and instantiated in Trieste, and it is so wildly different from what we have in the US. And then when I compare those things, I think we should not settle for, my gosh, just the fact that somebody didn't handcuff me when I was put in the back of a police car to be taken to the hospital, or that somebody was just kind, right? When we really could be doing so much more for people. And again, it's this balancing act of really needing a strong vision of something that really is justice, right? That people really deserve. And of course, we're dealing with the systems that we're dealing with, and we have to be realistic and we have to be pragmatic. So balancing those things. But if anything, I maybe see more risk of us losing sight of a deeper vision of what could be possible, a deeper vision of people with long-term disabilities should not be living in abject poverty in most of the world, including most high-income countries. That just as a baseline should not be happening, right? And so how can we mobilize around changing that? And I don't see us doing that at all. In fact, I did a couple of systematic reviews. Now, this is focused on the US literature, so I do not want to say that this extends to Australia or the UK or Europe, because it was for a US funder for a very specific purpose. But we looked at what research has actually happened in the US to document reductions in coercive interventions. What has actually been done to reduce or ameliorate poverty? And the answer is actually almost nothing, rather shockingly so. In fact, in interventions that we might think are about reducing coercion or reducing poverty, those things aren't even being measured, in fact. So if anything, I think we're maybe not allowing ourselves or empowering ourselves to be bold enough in really saying this is what it should be like, and how can we work towards this? How can we work ending disability, poverty? How can we work at severely reducing the amount of kind of coercion and pressure in systems?
We've got a couple of extra questions that are just coming through. I mean, maybe one thing you might like to comment on that Sharon added as you were talking was specifically within lived experience research and the voices that we still aren't hearing. Is there a risk, do you think, that we're still losing some of the voices even when we're doing lived experience research?
Absolutely. I mean, in the US, again, I think the work that the Alive Center is doing with the Lived Experience Network is incredible and bringing people together. I mean, I think in the US, if you look at the population of the US, if you look at the number of universities, I mean, we're mighty, but we are very small. And I constantly hear from students working in total isolation because I'm more visible. They find me somehow and they reach out and they're really working in incredibly with no support, no mentorship, right? Not seeing any kind of model of kind of lived experience integration and research around them. So I mean, I think that there's absolutely 100%. And then I would say when we look at intersectional kind of marginalization and oppression, like absolutely 100%. So I'm working on a big CTO evaluation, compulsory treatment orders, the US version of that. And when we think about like kind of the folks who are actually being impacted by CTOs, they currently have almost no voice in research, almost have no voice even in advocacy or policy. So I think we have a long, long way to go. And again, that's why sort of the centering of the most impacted is aspirational because people are often facing so many layers, right, of disadvantage, structural oppression, poverty, that they're not being set up to enter into these spaces or to have access. And that's a huge problem. And I think something we need to be working towards.
We might go to Dean, who's sitting there patiently with his hand up, and then we'll go back over to a couple more chat questions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. I mean, first and foremost, it's really nice to meet you, Nev. This is yeah, really grateful for this opportunity to hear you speak. I guess I want to come back to your point that you made beforehand around how transformative research requires it to be led by people with lived and living experience. How it's not enough to have that kind of advisory consultation role and just embed people within a team or have like one person in a lived experience role as a part of a research team. It needs to be driven by people with lived experience. I guess my question is, how do we actually create more lived experience research leaders? And not just that, also empower them with the skills necessary to succeed in leading in research. I think part of the challenge that we have, and this is at least within an Australian context, is that there's very few researchers who are at that leadership level, postgraduate, PhD level, in order to actually conduct the research. And yeah, within like the current ecosystem that we have, or it's an expectation to be working that level in order to secure grants and to lead research. There's a lot of kind of like a prickliness when it comes to professionalizing lived experience research workforces. Like, do you expect people with diverse lived experiences to be pursuing higher education and PhDs, or would you kind of try and make it more accessible? But in the current ecosystem that we have, it's not really accessible to many people. So I'm interested, like, how do we get from where we are right now to actually having more lived experience researchers at that senior level?
Yeah, and I mean, I think again, Michelle and I were talking about this at some length last week. I feel such internal conflicts, right? So I very, very explicitly focus on recruiting doctoral students, research coordinators. I've run something called the Lived Experience Research Academy in the US specifically. The sort of the criteria being having faced significant barriers in higher education and pursuing any kind of research trajectory due to psychiatric disability. And at the same time, there is so much about the culture of academic research that is very toxic, that is hyper productivity oriented. And so one can feel really conflicted about bringing people into this space and encouraging this pathway. And at the same time, If we don't infiltrate, nothing will change, because I think once you understand the level of influence in projects that is the day-to-day, if somebody is not there for the day-to-day, which means they have to be like employed, they have to be in a role, they can't be in some other job in the community, because that's just not, projects are intense and a lot of decisions made, and decisions get made in real time constantly. So I do think that if we want to really, really change, decision making, and, decision making in the context of what research is actually going to happen, we need people in leadership positions. And yeah, 100% we have to also kind of acknowledge really the depths and the impacts of kind of structural oppression, right? And work towards that, right? Like, how do we work towards the conditions that even enable more access to these spaces, right? Because we also can't just say, like, somehow just as things are, people don't have access to education, to higher education at all, in the United States, right? Huge proportion of the population. So like, I think we can't give up because of that, but I think we have to be very like humble and self-aware and keep going, right? Keep going, and simultaneously also trying to transform higher education so that it is not so fundamentally ableist, not so fundamentally hostile to people whose disabilities simply do not align with a paradigm of endless productivity, endless work, endless efficiency, right? So, I mean, it is a really important question, but I think it's really kind of a both and I don't think, like, sometimes there's these, well, if you're working in a research space, you're just automatically kind of co-opted. I don't think that's very productive, right? I think we need to get away from that, and we really need to like support each other, whether it's infiltrating policy, practice spaces, leadership. And if anybody is up there claiming like I speak for that's a fundamental problem. If anyone is in a leadership position, not fully and deeply acknowledging how many people continue to be excluded from these spaces, yes, that's a problem and probably should be called out. But I don't think we should just, kind of say, well, our movement can't have people who are genuine leaders in academia, because that just shoots the movement in the foot. And I think I often turn to sort of the Black feminist movement in the US. Bell Hook's writing is really powerful around this. Anti-intellectualism, reactionary critique of Black leaders in academic or theory spaces is not the way to go. That's just another side of oppression, and actually, the same oppression, just playing out in a different way.
Thanks for that, Nev.
Yeah, Nev, it puts me in mind a big signal for me is when I'm invited into a space to provide the lived experience perspective. And I turn around and say, there is no such thing as the lived experience perspective. I will bring a lived experience perspective for you, and I will acknowledge exactly what that comes from. And yes, there's no such thing as the. So what I see, and as I was listening to you and having a look at the questions that were coming through in the chat there, that there's actually a set of three there that knit together a lot of what you were talking about for a bit more depth. So first of all, to what extent do you think consumer researchers are leading or setting the agenda in the US as opposed to being invited in? And then somebody said, and how do we actually create some options where we're not just tinkering around the edges? And then going much deeper into what you were just saying, Beck has asked, if we have a passionate commitment to what we do, and we actually work on a premise that we find resilience in surviving the injustices, how do we actually protect against the extractive processes? And what do we do if the passion, or as Diana has said, the body runs out? And how do we have that movement continue? So those three I sort of see as a little trio of what you were just talking about.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I mean, And this is why the work of the Alive Center is so important, and the Lived Experience Network, and the fact that we're having this conversation and we're all here, because
I'll pay you later.
community is so important. Any of us as an N of one are going to be, end up subject to a whole lot of just tokenism, extractivism, etc. We have power when we can really come together collectively, when we can support each other. And I think that's what we need. I could say, well, like, grants that I'm the PI of, or I mean, Michelle could say the same. By definition, I guess, are lived experience led, formulated and designed, but that's not a solution, right? That's kind of isolated individuals doing the best they can. But the real way forward is bringing the community together and working together and supporting each other to get agendas through and prioritize. But you can't stop with prioritization. There has to be the power and the infrastructure to then really turn that into projects. And I also think you can be leading a project and still very, very constrained. So I think about the compulsory treatment order evaluation, which I'm co-leading. And there's still a lot of constraints in that case because it's funded by the state. And so you don't necessarily have the sort of the unfettered freedom that you wish that you had. So I think it's complicated, but yet again, the more that we can really form a movement of lived experience, leadership, co-leadership, and research, that's where my hope, that's where my faith is. That's where we'll be able to accomplish more for those of us who are now somewhat more established. Every kind of ounce of life energy that we can put into mentoring the next generation. One person can mentor a lot more than just one person, right? And so as we kind of can grow the movement, grow the number of people pushing for change in this space, able to critically intervene in this space, that's where the hope lies for me. And I think it really is. It is challenging the more isolated that one is. There is tremendous healing that becomes, kind of possible in solidarity. And when rather than just kind of having experienced something awful and you can't even talk to it to anyone else, you have, at the minimum, sort of a critical mass of folks that you can talk to and process with. And I find sometimes even just having somebody else with lived experience who I know gets it in the room, we don't even have to have a conversation. It's just the psychological fact of knowing I'm not the only one seeing and hearing this. There's someone else here who gets it, makes it so much easier and less kind of negatively psychologically impactful to be through that. So I think these are things that kind of keep me going and that I think are really important. I don't know if that answered all the questions, but
it did. And I'm aware we're coming towards the end of our hour, which seems to have gone so quickly. But we've got a finishing point here, I think, from Kristen that I'm just going to read out. She said, as a disabled woman, I'm constantly harmed by so-called consultations. Often they're asking the wrong questions, and if you do that, you get the wrong answers. It feels like this is deliberate, it's reductive, controlling engagement. I feel passionate about lived experience research. However, a lot of what is done feels like it doesn't include my experiences. And the very term lived experiences feels like it's being co-opted. So I think Kristen's probably just echoed a lot of, what we were talking about. So what's your feeling for, particularly there is so much passion. How do we get past what I'm going to be generous and say are good intentions, although often they're not, and make sure that we don't end up with our lived experience just co-opted into the same old, same old?
Yeah. I think this, I almost want to really, really, truly kind of turn back to the community. Like we as a community need to figure figure out more that we can do, both to prevent. So I've interviewed a number of folks who, because they, you know, kind of were in isolation, approached by researchers and really don't know, didn't have any kind of ability to know, is this real? Is this authentic? Is this genuine or not? And have ended up very harmed by it. So we need to develop community resources to protect each other, especially folks who are newer to these spaces, who don't have their guardrails up already, from the pain that probably many of us, if not all of us, have been through at some point. The sense of betrayal, the sense of, well, I thought I was here for this, and really it turns out that you don't actually care what I have to say at all. So we need to figure out ways to sort of to be more protective and supportive of each other, to be more visible, so that it doesn't take folks so long to find these kinds of communities. Again, you know, Alive's very existence is like really incredible, and we don't have that in the US. So if there's nothing visible, you don't know where to go. And then I think thinking about like, what does accountability, like how can we develop standards or articulate something around accountability, right? Like accountability that folks are not just exploiting the lived experience community, and how can we play a role? Again, I alternate between the sort of the punitive side, like, right, I want to sort of like go after the entities that I know are really exploiting people. And then sometimes I'm like, maybe a gentler approach, maybe, you know, kind of deep down, you know, people will understand if one could reach them in the right way. If they understood the harm they were causing, they would actually care, they would do things differently. But I think we as a community coming together to kind of figure out, how do we change this? How do we change this landscape? And how in the future do we stop folks from having to experience what many of us, you know, what many of us have, and certainly myself earlier on in my life, in particular, before I had any degree, in so many of these types of, you know, kind of advisory boards, not just on the research side and policy. And it's really, really, really harmful, and it can really decimate one's own self-esteem over time. So how can we stop that from happening to future generations?
Now, since I'm aware that we had to start a few minutes late, Kristen, did you want to have a last quick question with your hand up there?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I have to leave my camera off. It's not working properly.
That's
You get
okay.
lines running up and down the screen.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a bit disconcerting. This is just so helpful, just, you know, but I guess I wonder if there's a way to communicate to people, you know, in all situations. I don't know. I'm 60. I've been through a lot of stuff. I'm also a carer as well as being disabled, and you know, kind of occupy a kind of multiply marginalized space, I guess you could say. And yet, you know, I also experience significant privilege, like being white. But I've recently realized that actually when I've got it most wrong, because, you know, I get it wrong too when I'm advocating for my child, or when I'm advocating with them or trying to understand what it is they need. The times when I get it most wrong, and what I see when others get it most wrong, is when you think you know. That's the problem, knowing, quote unquote. When you think you know, you stop listening, you stop being curious, you stop asking because you know. And that's what I'm seeing, kind of this wholesale harm being done in the disabled community generally. But, you know, it's particularly harmful to people with psychosocial disabilities, is that, you know, they think they know. And it's a bit of a moot point, or almost, as to whether they're well-intentioned or not, because what they're doing is just devastating. So I don't know, is there a way, do you think, that we could kind of translate that to tell them, when you think you know, that's when you need to stop and ask and listen, not decide. Anyway, thank you.
Great point, Kristen.
Yeah,
Yeah, wrap us up.
I think that's, that's a really, that's exactly right. And sort of how do we do that? How do we, sometimes I feel like it's just not being understood. I mean, most generously, as Michelle put it, people's intentions are good. And I do think at least some of the time, there's just really not an understanding of how some of this comes off, how members of the lived experience community are impacted, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think part of it is we need to build more awareness. And at least in the US, I think there has been more progress around this on the racial front, right? I mean, understanding things that just get overlooked, microaggressions are talked about a lot, just as one example. So I think it's possible to build people's awareness. There are people who are knowingly, engaging in tokenization and extractivism because they want to get a grant, and really, in a sense, the intention isn't good, and that's maybe different. But just, I guess, I'm saying, no, we're over time. Such an important question. And again, I would just say that's what, if we as a community, right, can kind of start to come up with ideas, strategies, solutions, and if we can support each other, because nobody can achieve that in isolation, I think that's where my mind goes. But thank you, Kristen. Like, I think that's really, really important. And I think the pain is it's really real. This is not just like benign. People are really often harmed precisely because they care so much, and to care so much and then be sidelined, decentered, tokenized is very painful, and it really repeats various forms of exclusion, negative experiences, and systems being dismissed that, all too often we've experienced many, many times from the service user side.
Look, I think we could sit here and discuss this stuff all night. And I see we've got a couple of really meaty late questions in the chat. So what I'm going to actually impose on you, Nev, is ask if perhaps those questions we can take on notice and send to you for a written response to, if the team can capture the chat for us so that we make sure we've got those questions. Because I particularly think there's a comment there. I'm terribly sorry to hear that somebody's actually had an offer rescinded for a PhD for disclosing. And I actually think that the topic of disclosure is one that we should investigate much more deeply than in a couple of minutes. But certainly from a written response. And also there's a second one there about, collaborating movements and those sort of things. So we might take those on notice for a response afterwards, if you wouldn't mind, Nev. But everybody, if you would join me in thanking Nev very much for joining us this afternoon. I'm so happy that we could actually have the opportunity to have this chat. It's been really, really interesting. And I know there's been a lot of comments in the chat that it's been great to have you. And we hope you'll come back.
Thank you, guys. And yeah, just quickly, since I see a couple of my friends from the US in the audience, it really, Alive is open to us international. So please join. And then, we can kind of keep the conversation going in other ways. I have just joined as well.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear it.
You have to get Nev some business cards to hand out, Michelle, from the tour international.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining, Nev.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.